Afternoon, everybody. I'm Brad Gunn with Endurance. It's 3:30 on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in Santa Monica. Frankly, I'm surprised I'm here, much less anybody else. But this is this is the smart guy panel. Certainly me excluded. But this is we've had a couple planning calls, and I've done pretty much all the net diligence conferences, and I'm pretty confident when I say I have no idea how the hell this thing's going to turn out. We've got four folks with a lot to say, and the slides are all mixed up, and we'll see how it goes. But listen, the past 3 or 4 years, over the past 3 or 4 years, the cyber insurance market has reached critical mass. And for those who have been laboring in the cyber field for over a decade, it's finally reached critical mass. Buyer take-up has increased significantly. Buyers are purchasing much higher limits, and for a number of industries, cyber is no longer an optional buy. The market today, they say, is $2.5 billion, and depending on who you talk to, that's set to triple or more over the next 5 or 6 years. As we've talked many times in the net diligence conferences, cyber is, the cyber world is uniquely exposed. There are no geographical boundaries to limit the size, scale, or scope of a cyber event. And with the amount of gross limits being extended by, those carriers who have been in the market for a while, those limits can extend into the tens and the hundreds of billions of dollars. Certainly numbers that senior management and the board of directors begin to get interested in. Not in terms of gross premiums, although they demand those, but once you've got 30 billion plus of cyber exposure in the book, senior management wants to make sure you've got an idea what your catastrophe scenarios look like and whether or not you've thought them through, and you're covering them from not only an underwriting but a forms perspective. Now, the insurance industry is very familiar with modeling, and we've worked very closely with companies like AIR Worldwide and Equicat and RMS for many years, but focused on natural perils, windstorm, fire, earthquake. As we're all aware, the cyber world is substantially different. You've got new variants of malicious code being released every day. You've got state actors and organized crime going in and exploiting new vulnerabilities that change weekly. And you've got companies voluntarily handing hundreds of terabytes of data to public, private, and hybrid clouds, which introduces new exposures of its own. So you've got threat vectors that are growing and changing and morphing in real time. And for anybody who has worked on an earthquake model and has access to hundreds, or if you've got access to the historical, go back through history, you've got access to thousands of years of data. This is pretty scary stuff. So today we're going to talk about the state of the art and kind of where we are in the data analytics companies modeling these cyber exposures. And we've got four leading individuals to walk us through this. First of all, Patrick Florer. Patrick is the CTO and co-founder of Risk-Centric Security. He's got a very long list of important sounding titles in his official bio, but notably he's worked in IT, evidence-based medicine, and information security for 35 years. He also served as the data analyst for the net diligence claim survey that was discussed this morning. John Laux is a senior consultant with Aon Endpoint, the management consulting arm of Aon, and is also the cyber analytics leader for Aon Benfield. He helps insurance clients address a range of concerns in emerging areas such as cyber. He's a fellow of the Casualty Actuarial Society and is based in Chicago. Jay Jacobs, to my immediate left, has over 15 years of experience with IT and information security with a focus on cryptography, risk, and data analysis. He's a senior data scientist at BitSight Technologies, and prior to that, he was the lead data analyst at Verizon and co-author of the Data Breach Investigations Report. Jay is also the co-author of Data-Driven Security, a book covering data analysis and visualization for information security, and a co-founder of the Society of Information Risk Analysts. Finally, at the end, Dr. Thomas Gurnius is a principal scientist at AIR Worldwide, where he's been since 2003. Before turning his efforts to modeling cyber risk, he managed the development of both the AIR US wildfire and AIR Australia brushfire models. Dr. Gurnius received his PhD from Caltech and his AB from Harvard University, both in applied mathematics. Given the somewhat esoteric nature of our discussion, everybody felt that some slides would be helpful. We'll be dipping in and out of the slide deck, but we certainly want to make this as conversational as possible. So if anybody has any questions or comments, or especially disagreements, raise your hand and we'll pull you into the conversation. We want to try and make this fun. So we're going to start with a primer on cat modeling and where we are in traditional perils, and I will kick it over to Tom and John.
Next slide.
Okay.
Thought we'd just start this on a little bit of a lighthearted note, since this may get a little technical as we go along here. Two quotes that came to mind as the group was preparing for this session. The first one, which often gets attributed to Yogi Berra, but Niels Bohr, I think, was actually the one that originally said, "This prediction is difficult, especially about the future," which is sort of interesting given, as Brad said already, the history. Modelers and actuaries love to have a long history of good, high-quality data to work from, and that's just not the product line that we're talking about here. So that's certainly the challenge we're up against. And I think kind of on the other side, the quote from George Box, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And we're not aiming to get something that's exactly right with a high degree of scientific accuracy on here, but when modeling comes into place, and you can bring buyers and sellers together to make sense of the risk, then the market can start to do interesting things, and we'll have some examples of that.
Thank you, John. My supervisor at AIR for almost 10 years was a student of George Box, so that last quote I had to listen through many, many times. But okay, AIR is originally a natural catastrophe modeling firm, and a few years ago we took an interest in cyber, and we are approaching it as a potential catastrophe peril. And our claim is, or feeling, is that the Hurricane Andrew of cyber is coming. A little background for those who are not in the natural catastrophe world. AIR was founded in the mid-'80s by a woman named Karen Clark, who essentially founded the catastrophe modeling field for insurance. And for 5 or 6 years, she had a hurricane model and a catastrophe model that she was selling to insurers and reinsurers, and was not getting any serious traction. There were a few this product was selling a little bit, but nobody was taking it very seriously because the kinds of numbers she was projecting for possible potential losses just seemed too high. And people just kind of poo-pooed it, said, well, it's kind of interesting to think about, but it'll never happen. And then 1992, Hurricane Andrew, and to put things in perspective, in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew, 11 insurers, I think the genteel term is went insolvent. I think the less genteel term is went bankrupt. It was just that, and moreover, the numbers that as the event was evolving, while the hurricane was still offshore, were within a few billions of what actually happened. I think 14 billion was the aftermath survey number, and I think Karen predicted 15 billion. So it's,
Being off by $1 billion is good in our business. Just
so, if, speaking too long maybe on the NatCat side, but our sense is that the wake-up call in cyber has not happened yet. It is not a target kind of event. It will not be. It's not a Sony kind of event. I think the wake-up call will be some form of massive aggregation. One potential way in which that might happen is a serious breach of a major cloud provider. So that's why that red cloud hovering over people, servers, computer servers is there. Next slide, please.
Yep.
So when we have our coffee table talks about how is the Hurricane Andrew going to happen, the cloud seems to be the recurring. That seems to be at AIR our popular opinion that that would be the way. But there are other ways it can happen. One can have major aggregation from a power grid failure, blackout, that's driven by a cyber event to begin with. One could have major virus or other malware impacting an operating system that is no longer supported. So for Windows XP is a good example. Windows XP hasn't been supported now for a couple of years, I believe, by Microsoft. However, although it's less than 10%, it's still in the high single digits of percent of computers out there that run it. So that a successful virus or malware that takes advantage of some security failure of Windows XP could become an aggregate event if it spreads across all the computers that use it. The other, I have this little pinwheel of a credit card and debit cards. If we think of point of sale breach, grabbing a lot of credit card information, yes, that's bad and can result in serious claims and all that. But if you really want to wake up in a cold sweat at night, think of one of the services that process credit card companies being hacked. I'll get the numbers wrong, but they are ballpark right. About half of all credit card transactions in the U.S. get processed through about 10 primary companies. So just think in terms of that and be dismayed. And finally, a hack against aircraft, either in the form of aircraft security, controllers, or in terms of actual computers on the planes themselves. Currently, there seems to be a lot of hype about cars with computers potentially hackable. But think of major airlines also having that same issue potentially. And so these kinds of scenarios are the types that could end up in large aggregation events that would be nightmarish, and when losses would not be described in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars, but they would be described in billions. Next slide, please. One of the key points, key themes in modeling of any kind, and cyber is no exception, is to take very complex systems, abstract away as much of the complexity as you possibly can, yet not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, still retaining enough differentiation so that you can make distinctions that are sensible and necessary. So, for example, going back to the hurricane or wind perils for residential houses, there are engineers who actually keep track, who go into do post-disaster surveys and look at things such as the spacing of nails on beams or the length of nails that were used. That's enough. That's drilling down very deep. When we model natural catastrophes, we don't think of houses as being described by the separation of nails in their beams. We think of them as either wood frame houses or perhaps masonry houses, just a few categories that allow us to distinguish between their vulnerabilities, and yet it doesn't force us to drill down into unfathomable detail. So also for cyber risk, the challenge, and it's a big one, is to take a very complex systems that scatter over there on the top right. Think of those as maybe individual computers in a complex net. And the idea is for us to try to abstract that down to something much more tractable, something that we can understand and describe and parameterize, and yet can also wrap our heads around and be able to get the main juice of what's really important without having to chase all of the little individual pieces around. Next slide, please.
So I think the main takeaway is that if your job is to go in after a disaster and measure the space between nails in a collapsed house, there really are worse jobs than underwriting and claims handling in the insurance industry.
The air is very fresh after a storm.
Silver lining.
So, and we are in the process of applying or adapting our modeling, catastrophe modeling framework to the cyber domain at AIR. And those of you, I don't know how many of you have had dealings with AIR for natural catastrophes, but this schema here, I've made it look very cybery with the skull and the broken laptop, etc. But if you just if you take out the pictures and look at the words, this is essentially a scheme a framework that applies to all our catastrophe models. So we describe the hazard in two pieces. One is to stochastically generate events for a catalog of events, and then for each of those events, we calculate intensity calculations. We have an exposure database for natural catastrophes. It would be a database of houses, addresses, or geocodes, the kind they are, their replacement values, that sort of thing. For cyber, it's a little bit different, but it's typically companies and descriptions of their security posture, whether they have a chief information security officer or not, what kinds of encryption they use, etc. I won't drill down to today, but we are in the process that is actually almost finished of developing cyber exposure database format, if you will, with a schema, I guess is the word. And that we expect to go public with sometime, hopefully before the end of the year. So it's using the combination of a description of the hazard and its intensity, as well as the kinds of exposures that are being attacked, we can use a description of the vulnerability to come up with estimates of the physical damage, or in terms of cyber damage to equipment, records stolen or corrupted, etc. Applying insurance policy conditions here, just primitively shown as some deductible and limit arrangement, eventually coming out with the an estimate of the losses.
Thank you very much, Tom. John, can you spend a few minutes speaking to how these models are actually being used in the in the physical world and their effect on the carriers that are working with them?
Yeah, sure, Ben. So we've been talking about natural catastrophe models as sort of the analog that I think we're hoping to move toward with what's happening with cyber right now. So I think just a little bit of context in terms of what models have done in other markets, and the natural catastrophe risk and the property insurance world is a great example of where models have been really effective. So just a couple points to hit here. So this slide shows pricing. So point number one, when you have models that are agreed on by a number of different participants in the market, you can actually get the buyers and the sellers to bicker less and agree more on what the cost of insurance and reinsurance should be. So the point of this slide is essentially that. If you look at pricing on catastrophe reinsurance, which is the area most affected in the market by the price of catastrophe risk, you see what you'd kind of expect to see: big spikes after Hurricane Andrew, when everyone recognized, oh, the models aren't very good, let's correct them. And then similarly, a big spike after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. But the longer term trend that you see is that the pricing for catastrophe risk kind of trends, it spikes up and then it trends back in line with inflation overall. And over time, the models continue to improve, they refine themselves. And so just in the last 2 years, we've actually seen the long-term trend on reinsurance pricing actually dropping below long-term inflation, which I think is actually a success story in terms of what this risk is and the fact that we've been able to contain the cost of it over time. Next slide. So second major point, if you've got good models, again, not all models are wrong, but they're useful. If you can get people to agree on a model and agree on the price of business, that actually allows you to bring more supply into the market. There's a whole side business niche area that Ann Benfield's very involved with in terms of providing securitization as an alternative to traditional reinsurance. You can talk to me afterwards if you want to know the details, but it's become a huge business, and so what we've seen in the last this goes back 15 years, but it's longer, is there's been a tremendous amount of non-traditional investors who are interested in catastrophe risk. And we've been able to sell catastrophe risk to pension funds, hedge funds, a whole variety of investors that are not the typical insurance or reinsurance customer. And as we've seen, 18% annual growth over a 15-year time period. And for the year to date, almost $25 billion in capacity that we've been able to seed off to the capital markets. So just a final point on this. One of the questions folks have is, how good are these models? How good can they actually be? And again, we've said they're wrong, but how wrong are they? So the left hand is not necessarily to scale, but Aon Benfield is a big consumer of catastrophe models. We have our own as well as RMS's and AIR's. So we did some back testing after the 2004-05 storm seasons as well as 2008. And the term that we use is model miss, which is essentially, if you look at the actual damages as a ratio to the model damages, what's that ratio? So 1.0 would be you were right on the mark. And we've actually found that the models tend to be, in this scenario, they were about 50%, the actual damage was about 50% larger than the modeled damages were. So, what does that break down to? It's not necessarily the model's fault. The model's not trying to model the claims adjustment costs for the insurer, so that's an extra piece. There's perils that aren't modeled, which, in 2005, the storm surge that went over the levees in New Orleans was, I think, a surprise to everybody. Data quality. If you have bad data, the model's just not going to work for you that well. And then lastly...
We've got a question.
No.
Yeah.
So if we take that slide of 1.55 on the model list and apply that back to the previous slide, 25 billion, is there a correlation that is that enough? I'm trying to say, is there a correlation between this slide and the last slide? So since 25 billion in capacity, is the model, is that enough? Is 25 billion enough to handle?
There's not a good question. There's not a natural correlation between the two slides. Most companies buy catastrophe reinsurance we talk in terms of a probable maximum loss or a PML. Most companies will buy to kind of their 1 in 250 kind of worst case scenario, which is far beyond the events. Katrina was not a 1 in 250 event. It was, I think, about a 1 in 40 based on the models. And keep me honest on that, but
Somewhere between those two.
yeah, somewhere between those two.
So 1 in 40 year, that model miss is of 1.55 is what? For that year only, it was only 50% off?
For that modeled event.
So
Correct, yeah. So just a couple comments on that. I mean, first of all, I think one of the points we're trying to make on the right-hand side of the slide here, so two different modeling companies, A and B, the models get refined over time. And so if you look at the X+1 and the Y+1, those are more recent versions of the models. And the model miss in refined versions of the models after the event get closer to 1.0. So this is in some ways, this is a cat and mouse game. I mean, we're constantly learning from disasters as they happen and incorporating that feedback back into how the models work. So it is a learning process. We saw a similar outcome in Hurricane Sandy more recently. I think just by way of comparison, because these numbers can be a little off-putting, if you want to look at a different industry that uses models, look at the financial industry in 2008. And the models for derivatives and things like that were off by like a factor of 36 in some cases. I mean, tremendous orders of magnitude. So the fact that we're only talking about a 50% overage is bad in one sense, but compared to other industries, we're actually doing pretty well.
Thanks very much, John. I want to make sure we get Patrick and Jay into the conversation. Patrick,
I'm getting my nap, so that's good.
can we spend a few minutes talking about getting back to cyber, kind of where we are? Let's level set in terms of what perils we're looking at and how we've developed these models today.
So first of all, I'm not an insurer. I'm not an underwriter. I don't even really live in your world, except at this conference. I find it fascinating. And I have, the last 3 years, done the analysis for the Net Diligence Report. But I do study data breaches. I've researched them for the last 6-7 years, primarily from the information security side of things, from the information risk analysis side of things, and also really from the definitional side of things. So, if we're going to talk about a data breach, the first question that occurs to somebody like me is, well, what are we actually talking about? What is a data breach? And I had a definition in here, and I don't want to gainsay the lawyers in the crowd, but I think it's safe to say that there's probably no generally accepted definition of data breach that holds sway over like one ring to bind them all, to think of Lord of the Rings. But all of them seem to include some notion of private data, accidental or unintentional or unauthorized exposure, and that's about as close as I can come. Now, I think the Verizon group in the DBR, one of the things they do that I really like is they distinguish quite clearly up front between a security incident, of which there are usually tens and 20s of thousands each report, and data breaches, which are confirmed exposures of data of some sort, which are more like a couple thousand.
Did you want me to go into that in detail?
I mean, you can if you like, yeah.
It's just, I'll do it very briefly,
Sure.
actually. So a security incident is anything where confidentiality is compromised, the integrity of system or data is compromised, or the availability of a system or information or service is compromised. That's a security incident. And then a breach, a data breach, is where you focus in on that confidentiality. And that is where somebody not normally authorized to look at some piece of data had access to or was able to copy that data. So that's the differentiation. It's pretty clear, and it's actually pretty useful just to simplify it down like that.
I agree, thanks. So, as is probably apparent to all of you, yes?
Just sorry, because it was right there. Has anyone come up with a widely accepted schema? I know there's data
For-
sharing SIGs for modeling the breach. No.
Yeah.
Preventing breach, no.
Did you have a qualifier, like a successful one?
There's some schemas, but
Yeah, there's several. So, yeah, and that's one of the challenges. I mean, there's several repositories for public breach data out there, and they all have their own. At Verizon, it was developed what's called the Varus Framework, and that it's very, very detailed. But the problem with that is it's very, very detailed, right? And I think MITRE did the same thing, and MITRE went like 10 times more detailed. And so the challenge is always, when you're looking at the data, you always want more data. And when you're collecting the data, you're thinking, my God, there's so much data to collect, right? And so you have to balance that. You have to kind of balance the benefit at the end with the cost to get each data point. And so there are a few things out there. Most people just make up their own and go with it right now, though.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, the tension right now is that we've been using that database ourselves recently, and I mean, just there's so many fields, and most of them are empty, or they're just like default to null values. And if you can get the number of records in the breach, like you're doing well on a lot of them.
And it's challenging too, trying to analyze some of that stuff. Like some of the frameworks will call out, describe the entire event as a hack, right? And there's, when you actually get into it, there's 1,000 variations of what happens when somebody's at a keyboard. And so to call all of those one thing, it becomes very, very convoluted to try and break that apart and do anything with it. So there's some challenges, and it all depends on what you're trying to do. If maybe the purpose is just insurance, maybe that's good enough. But if you want to try and understand what companies can do to get better, just calling everything a hack, and I think 80% of that data was called a hack. That's not helpful at all. And so it's just trying to define what you want to do, and that'll help.
But Jay, that helps define the value of, say, the net diligence claim survey.
Yep.
Because
So that's one of the segregators in the net diligence report, the attack type. It's one of 4 or 5. There's another framework that has some traction. It's called FAIR, the Factor Analysis of Information Risk. It's a rather detailed, elegant framework. Jay and I have both worked with it.
It's more of a modeling technique, though, more than a framework for classifying
to me,
breaches.
the framework defines the model, I guess. That's why I bring it up.
Sure.
Anyway, to kind of come back to where I was, as most of you will realize, there's not just one kind of data breach. There are, a number of kinds. Intellectual property breaches can be different from credit card, debit card kinds of breaches, can be different from exposure of merger and acquisition plans. So one size definitely does not fit all. And the kind of cost matrix and analytic approach you will take is gonna depend specifically on your scenario at hand. Another thing, and I've actually heard this come up today, and I was pleased because it's the first time I've heard anybody say anything about it except me, which is when we're talking about the costs of a breach, whose costs are we really talking about? And it turns out there are probably 8 or 10 different parties. Most of you are probably most concerned about the cost of paying out your claims. The breached entity is obviously going to be most concerned about what it's costing them. But, everybody else, these folks I have listed here, employees, shareholders, issuing banks, customers, business partners, there are lots of people in a breach who will experience a cost of some sort. I guess another initial question, and this is a little bit different than modeling hurricanes. So granted, we don't have a lot of data, and last time I checked, unless I'm missing something, hurricanes and tornadoes and floods are not intelligent adversaries. So this throws a major wrench into the thinking. How do we deal with an intelligent, adaptive adversary? And I'm sorry I have to tell you that I haven't figured it out yet. I don't imagine anybody really has. I can talk. The good news is maybe of the 3 kinds of attacks I think of, which are accidents, targeted attacks, and opportunistic attacks, only one of them really involves this intelligent adversary, and that's the targeted. So when it comes to system failures and accidents, you would hope that a help desk or people in a company would be keeping track of how many laptops they lost, how many system crashes they had, that sort of stuff. Opportunistic attacks, John and I started to have a discussion about this last night. You might be able to model that with just some kind of randomness. So just to be sure we're on the same page, I think of an opportunistic attack as some people used to call them script kiddies, but listen, the tools they can purchase for a song on the internet are so sophisticated that would scare you. So it's somebody who writes a script and fires off maybe 1,000 or 10,000 Metasploit probes while he or she goes off to the coffee shop and comes back and sees what looks interesting in the logs and takes it from there. So those are some kind of general considerations. When I think of modeling, I come at it sort of simple-mindedly. There's no need, I think, in information security to distinguish between peril and hazard and some of the terms that you use in insurance. It's more really just either loss or loss exposure, money, or in some cases you're talking about impairment, what I call the impairment of your mission. So if you're a nonprofit, if you're the military or the government, in many cases, yes, there's a financial component, but the bigger deal is, has your mission been compromised? So you think of the OPM breach, apart from whatever financial implications this thing may have, it is going to have significant impairment attributes for the intelligence community, for the ability to, hang on to our undercover agents and that sort of thing. I just have a couple other little things to say. I guess let's go to the next slide. I want to talk about, that was my screen that went out. I want to talk about some of the data sources we have for impact. And there are quite a few. These are the public ones. So obviously we have the Net Diligence Reports. Ponemon Institute publishes all sorts of research. Some of their methodology is controversial in some sectors. Actually, Larry Ponemon and I are friends. I'm a fellow at his institute, and it all started with a disagreement over his methodology for cost per record and costing of breaches. I mean, it just $200 a record on average overall just doesn't jive with what we know from real numbers, either from the claims study, which granted is kind of a lower bound to the cost of breach, but still it's a long ways from that $13 median per record we heard about this morning to $200 a record. I can't get there. So some of these other sources, Verizon, great source for forensics, and they started to do some work with actually the net diligence data this year. Data Loss Identity Theft Resource Center, they track public breaches. They don't have much impact data. Some people do freedom of information requests. If it's a breach at a publicly traded company, you can go to their SEC filings. There's a wealth of information. You have to stay with it for years. I've been keeping check on TJX for the last 6 years because these, as the lawyers will know in this crowd, these things don't happen and be done in 20 minutes. They could last for 10 years, and I'm sure that's of interest to the insurers as well. Now, I realize that I'm kind of speaking to sort of general terms. I haven't said a word about probabilistic analysis distributions that are appropriate. I want to let some other people have a chance to talk too. So that's kind of my piece of this spiel. It's a very difficult area, and these 1.5 ratios that you've got, I would be surprised if anybody's model these days was anywhere near that close on a data breach.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Jay, can we move to your frequencies slide?
Yes, please. So I only have one slide, and this is it. So this is actually from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. This is from last year, 2014 report. And across the top, I did some work because we were talking about this, one size doesn't fit all. And what are the different things that happen within this world of cyber? And essentially what I did is I took, I think with this, it was almost 100,000 different security incidents. And actually, I think for this particular one is just showing the data breaches where data is confirmed to be compromised. But what we have across the top are the patterns that came out of the data. I did some cluster analysis and looked at how things clustered up, and we gave these clusters some names. So across the top, we've got the first is the point of sale intrusion. And that very, very distinct footprint, obviously is in the headlines recently. And we talk about the changing environment. You know, tornadoes generally don't change much, but in point of sale, you know, you mentioned TJ Maxx, Patrick, back in 2006, I think that occurred, and 2007. And so during that time, there were a lot of victims, actually, large retailers being compromised at point of sale. 2009, a guy by the name of Albert Gonzalez was arrested. He was one of the leaders, part of those groups, arrested and convicted. All of a sudden, we see a shift in point of sale. And we start seeing smaller victims. Rather than going after these few big targets and getting a lot from each of them, they started hitting these mom and pop shops and getting a handful of records from each of them, but they automated it. And all of a sudden we went from a handful of victims to hundreds per year. And then now we're starting to see that shift back. Everyone has heard of like Home Depot, Target, things like that. So that's starting to shift back. And then just real quick across the top, web application attacks. There's a couple of sub-patterns within there. Insider misuse, that's employees doing things that they shouldn't. Theft and loss, that's a physical loss of hard drives, laptops, things like that, and that's very prevalent. Miscellaneous errors, employees accidentally posting things to the internet, sending an email to the wrong person, right person, wrong attachment. The crimeware, which is just a malware type of a thing, very opportunistic. And then we've got payment card skimmers. That's a physical, any machine that accepts a credit card probably has been tried to be tampered with at some point. Gas pumps, ATMs, things like that. Denial of service, and that's just availability type thing. The cyber espionage, and what's interesting, if you guys remember the keynote this morning where you said that the number one thing everybody should worry about is espionage. If we look down this column, these are the industries on the left. This is not evenly distributed, right? Espionage, point of sale, obviously is not evenly distributed because things like manufacturing doesn't have a point of sale system, right? But cyber espionage, these things are not evenly distributed. So if you want to talk about frequency of events, that's what this is trying to show. And then the last one is everything else. These are events that were just either too vague in the data collection or too small. Like the next pattern probably would have been ex-employees coming back at their previous employer. There was another pattern in there. But one of the things that we're talking about, and Tom, I'm going to tickle you a little bit with this one, but and Tom said this earlier, he said that there are 3 legs to the stool. I'm going to feed you for something coming up here. But 3 legs to the stool is we try to model what is going on in here. One is, what is the company themselves doing? What policies do they have in place? What controls do they have in place? Who are the people? What are they doing? That's the first leg, right? And that, this is talking about Verizon, but I'm at BitSite right now, and that's largely what BitSite is focusing on. There I got my one plug-in. The second
Hear
one
that,
is...
Ira?
So the second leg, though, is what the attackers are doing, what is actually occurring in that breach, right? Are they motivated by financial gain? Is it espionage, intellectual property? Is it a bored teenager? Is it a terrorist organization? And are they going after web applications? Are they going after your databases? What are they doing, right? To understand that part, that's that second leg. The third leg is the impact. What actually happens? You know, one of the more common attacks is that attackers scan the internet looking for web servers that have a specific known vulnerability. Then they get into that web server, automatically compromise it, and then start using it as a repository to stick things that they're exfiltrating from another company, things like that. And even though like that web server may have incredibly valuable information on it, they won't even see it, right? It's just completely automated. And the impact to that victim is really minimal, right? There's almost no impact at all. But compare that to intellectual property theft, where now your entire business now might be at jeopardy from that. So, and Tom, that was a feed to you to talk about that impact side, if you'd like.
All right, thank you. I did bring up that in an earlier conversation with Jay, I talked about the 3-legged stool, and basically, this entire cyber problem is just too big for any one person or any one company to handle comprehensively. And at AIR, we believe we now have 2 out of 3 legs of the stool fairly solidly in place. The pieces of the puzzle that we need are incident data. We need to get a credible view of the threat itself, and so to form a basis for our Monte Carlo simulations. We need to get a handle on the vulnerability data to reliably understand the relativities between companies, what kinds of attacks they suffer, what kinds of losses they sustain, and to also to add a real-time capability to our model. And finally, the third leg of the stool is a real-world loss data. So as far as incident data goes, we very recently signed a collaboration agreement with Risk-Based Securities. And as far as the vulnerability data goes, we very recently signed a collaboration agreement with BitSight. So AIR is formally collaborating with those two institutions. And the third piece is a bit of a problem child. To complete a good, solid picture, we need real-world cyber insurer loss data and exposure data to produce accurate and robust loss estimates. And historically, in the natural catastrophe area, when I say we, I mean AIR and our competitors, have evolved relationships with insurers, small and large alike, where those insurers quite freely share their claims and exposure data in return for an early version, beta versions of our models, and some perhaps ad hoc analyses that we would do for them. In cyber, it's been a little bit more difficult. Sometimes the same insurer, but a different part of the building. When they deal with cyber risk and cyber claims, their attitude tends to be that these claims give us our competitive advantage, and we paid for those claims very literally by paying them out. What is the benefit to us to share with you? And I would submit that pooling that data with an outfit like AIR, letting us anonymize it and letting us use it comprehensively to validate our models and to produce accurate and robust loss estimates for future scenarios, it will benefit everybody. Big and small alike, even the big outfits, you may feel comfortable that your underwriting is very solidly based. You may feel that you do not want to pool because you have so much data. Why would you want to share with somebody who has less? But the almost certain fact is that even your data set has its biases. You have corporate inbred underwriting biases that that can be evened out when mixed in a full pool. But if you play only in your own backyard, you'll never find it.
So Tom, excuse me, to summarize, you've got two legs of one stool for one peril, data breach, kind of sorted out. The problem that the carriers in the room have is that we've got a whole bar room full of cyber exposures that today our portfolios are covering. And I've, the underwriters in the room have done, CAT scenario modeling, and of the 11 significant ones I've found, only 2 have involved data breach. So there's certainly a lot to, there's certainly a lot of work to go going forward. I'm going to jump ahead 3 slides, hopefully, slowly. Okay, whose slide was this yours, John?
Yeah.
We've got a few minutes to close. Can you touch on this and talk about where you think we're going to take this going forward?
Yeah, sure. So we've been talking about property and natural catastrophe as sort of the hopeful analogy for where we see cyber going in a couple of years. And I guess the question is that actually going to play out? And as I was thinking about this talk, I thought about earlier in my career when I was an actuary doing a lot with D&O insurance and trying to build predictive models in that realm. And so it got me thinking, is cyber more like property or is it more like casualty? Because there's elements of both. There's the first party piece and there's the third party liability piece. And as you go down the list, I think the reality is cyber, at least today, is a lot more like casualty when you really look at it. The things that it has going for it that some other kind of niche casualty lines don't have is there is a first-party component to it, and Aon's experience may not be universal for the industry, but it's generally the first-party piece that's driving claims. So that at least you tend to know the outcome of that pretty quickly after a breach happens. And the small losses, if you just look at the number of incidents or whatever word you want to use, are very high versus, in D&Os driven by securities class action lawsuits, there's generally fewer than 200 of those a year. In the actuarial world, that doesn't even begin to touch a decent-sized data set to do anything really useful off of. So, so there's, and I think furthermore, with property, we at least kind of know what a hurricane is and an earthquake, and we can, debate about the flood, or the storm surge effect. In cyber, we really don't even know what that hurricane is going to look like yet. So we're much more in the realm of unknown unknowns than known unknowns. So I think that's just to set up, kind of the challenge of this. The other thing I'd say, just from the conversations I've been part of, everything we're doing in modeling is exciting and it's cool and it's great. And if it to the extent it helps us manage risk, that's awesome. I think in some ways the regulators or the de facto regulators are going to start to demand answers before we get models to the point where we actually feel good about them. We talked to AM Best a fair bit. They're starting to sniff around this space. They haven't quite figured out what they want to do yet, but I think insurers are going to start to ask more probing questions in the next year or so. And for those who are following Lloyd's, they put out their blackout scenario. It wasn't their scenario, but they put their name on it a couple of months ago, and sort of starting to look at some of those more catastrophic disaster scenarios and what impact that could have on insurers at Lloyd's. And we're expecting within the next year that Lloyd's is actually going to have a realistic disaster scenario for cyber, which will be, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it's the first one other than natural catastrophe risk that they've expected insurers to be able to hold capital to. And that's going to require them to come up with some answers if they don't have them already.
Indeed, John. We'll move to John's last slide, which I think is an excellent summary. And what we're going to do is we're going to go speed round, right to left, 45 seconds. Where is the CyberCat modeling business going to go in the next 3 to 5 years? John or Jay?
Wow. I think it's absolutely incredible. And I think hands down in 3 to 5 years, there's going to be just leaps and bounds and advancements and things like that. And we're going to be learning a ton as we go. So I think in 3 to 5 years, I think that the amount that we don't know is going to be a little bit smaller.
All right. Patrick?
Well, I think for those of us who model and those of you who model, 3 to 5 years from now, hopefully we will have some real-world results to evaluate our models by. So, I mean, it's great to produce a beautiful model, but the proof on the pudding is, what's that number you called?
The model miss?
Yeah, the model miss. So if the model miss is 37, maybe we have more work to do. If the model miss is 1.1 or 0.8, we might be feeling pretty good. And it could easily take 3 to 5 years to get there. But that for me is going to be the real validation of whether this works or not.
All right, John?
I think it's the job of us in modeling to be educators for everyone in the industry as far as what the risks can be to facilitate both the purchase of cyber insurance as well as the management of it. And I think that in 5 years we will be having a livelier discussion about that and understanding the nuances of it more. That said, keep your underwriters around because I think they're still going to be really important in 5 years.
Okay.
All right, Tom?
So in 3 to 5 years, I expect that certain kinds of events, cyber events, we will have very good statistical descriptions for, including breach, but beyond that, things like distributed denial of service attacks, disruption of electronic commerce, interruption of internet access. I think we will have good statistical models for. What we will not have in 3 to 5 years is perhaps the most interesting of all. We will not have good statistical models to describe physical damage resulting from cyber attacks. And those are the most interesting scenarios to think about, in some cases the most scary, but they are so one of that they are not going to naturally flow out of a statistical analysis of existing data, whereas some of the others that I mentioned will.
I'd like to thank the panel and thank you for showing up. Have a good afternoon.